Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 189. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Brooklyn Quintana about her latest book, Blood in the Water. It is the second book in her Fynneas Fog series and the follow-up to her debut novel, Nine of Swords. Blood in the Water is a young adult fantasy novel that takes place at a nightmarish military academy on a tropical island. A catastrophic event has changed everything for Fynneas Fog and his friends, and they must pick up the pieces and try to move on, as the story becomes darker with much more at stake. Brooklyn aimed for a more horror story vibe with this latest novel, while still carrying on the mystery in the background and punctuating the tension with moments of levity. Even though this series is a passion project for Brooklyn, and one whose story idea has been with her since she was a little girl, she was nervous about writing book 2. Would the characters sound and behave like themselves? Fortunately for fans of the series, the answer is yes. In this episode, I'll chat with Brooklyn about her writing journey, why the second book took almost twice as long to write as the first book, and her ongoing efforts to turn these books into a graphic novel series, as well as a few other things coming up. Brooklyn Quintana, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book, Fynneas Fog, Blood in the Water. Now, this is a sequel to a book we talked about maybe a year and a half ago. That was the first book in this series, Fynneas Fog, Nine of Swords. So you've come out with a sequel now. Maybe before we start talking about Blood in the Water, I thought what we should probably do is reacquaint ourselves with Fynneas and his friends and possibly enemies. So tell us a little bit about the cast of characters and then sort of set us up for when Blood in the Water opens.
Right. So Finn is the Prince of Asteria, and he is going to the Morency Military Academy, which is on this tropical island filled with all kinds of monsters and everything. And he's a first year, so he's 12, and he's got 11 other students in his year. So there's a dozen of them at this nightmarish military academy. And he's got his cousin, Prince Holland, who is with him, who's also in the same year. And book 1 is really the two of them acquainting themselves with not only the school itself, but kind of the concept of what it's really like to be a prince. And it's both of their first time away from their respective homes. So they've never really had to interact with their noble born peers so much. So they have to try and learn to make friends and relate to people and just normal kid things. You know, you're 12, you're growing up. It's a weird, awkward time of life. But you're also going to this military academy because they are anticipating a war or some sort of conflict happening. So everything's very accelerated and it's very rough. So they really have to form those bonds with the other kids around them who are not only going to be at the school with them, but when they all grow up, you know, these are the people who will be in charge of the military and who will be in charge of the Navy. So it's forging those bonds of friendship that will hopefully help them in the future. And some wild things are going on in the background that are causing Finn and Holland some trouble. not only at school, but abroad in their homeland across the country. The status quo is certainly crumbling in book one. And so at the end of book one, something very catastrophic happens, and both princes are left kind of in this place of, I've accomplished so much, but now everything I thought I was going to be doing has really been upheaved by this horrible incident that's happened. And then book two starts a few months back. So it starts almost halfway through book one in a different part of the setting, where you kind of see the goings on in the background and the shady dealings and why the horrible thing in book one happened and how it happened. And then it immediately jumps back to Finn and Holland at the end and picks up from almost the exact second book one ends. Now you're back with Finn and Holland, and you're seeing how they're handling it, but now you just have a bit more background information.
Let's talk a little bit about Fynneas and Holland and their journeys. How do they differ in book two from the characters we met in book one?
I mean, I think their bond is certainly stronger as a unit together. They function very well together, let's say. And in book two, you see how they maybe no longer function very well as individuals. And other characters notice that. And because of the circumstances of book two, despite how clingy they are to each other by necessity, the circumstances of book two kind of force them into separate situations where they do have to function as individuals again. And you very much see how differently they handle it and the insecurities that have now built up, not only with having to do things by themselves again and without the other one by their side, but also the insecurities that have built up because of the events of book one.
Now, I think when we talked before, you had ideas for this series, general ideas about how many books you wanted in the series. I'm curious, writing book two after finishing book one, how easy was that to jump into the sequel?
I really wish I could say it was easy and, I had the characters down and I just hopped right into it. But book two took me almost double the amount of time to write than book one, which sounds, I feel like, insane to somebody because, you would think you just wrote this nearly 800-page book with these characters and this world. It should be so easy to jump into book two. But I had such an idea of what I wanted for book two, and it took a while to kind of get there. It was almost like sculpting when you have the big rock in front of you and you can imagine what you want the sculpture to look like, but it took a lot of chiseling until I could finally start to see it take shape. So there was a lot of writing and rewriting and then scrapping it and starting over and then, twisting the narrative to fit kind of what I was envisioning a little more every time it went astray. It was like, oh, we have to correct course again and get back on track. Because I did have and still do have a very definite idea of what I want for the series, how many books there's going to be, how it's going to end. So getting book two to not only be a satisfying story in and of itself, but to fit the overall narrative and the kind of genre I wanted to twist it into, it took a lot more time.
Did anything change from those kind of original plans that you had for book two and the general series when you sat down to write book two? Had things changed? Had the story changed for you?
I think that overall, the overarching narrative of the 9 books is still very the same. And I knew when I sat down to write book two that I really wanted to have a kind of horror vibe to it. I've always loved horror movies. They really speak to me, if that makes sense. I like that aesthetic. I like kind of the scare factor. I like that Guillermo del Toro-esque kind of whimsical, strange fantasy that is downright terrifying at times. So I knew I wanted to have that sort of vibe and feel and aesthetic to book two. but how I went about it drastically changed from the moment I sat down to write to this published version that we have now.
So that was a bit of a departure then, the horror aesthetic from book one.
I think so. I mean, book one definitely had its elements of classic horror tropes, like the vines that move out of nowhere, and there's these creepy monsters, and a lot of like scary things happen at night. But overall, book one was more of your classic fantasy adventure coming of age story. And then the foundations, I think, were very much laid in book one with those occasional instances of something kind of creepy or scary happening to really set the foundation for book two to have a more dark horror vibe. I mean, by no means is book two just like a straight horror book. It is definitely still a fantasy with an ongoing mystery happening in the background, but there are definitely more of those classic horror elements that are going on to kind of seep into the story, if you will. Like it's there. It's just not an outright horror book.
Is that something you think will carry over into the other books, or do you have plans to make each book feel a bit different from its predecessors?
Yes and no. I really personally, on a personal level, I very much enjoy dark fantasies. Not like grim dark where everything is morbid and grimy and there's no happiness or humor. I really enjoy the humor that's incorporated into both books. I think it really lends itself to the situation, and the characters are young, so it's fun to have some moments of levity. You can't be too serious. And like I said, book one had that fantasy adventure feel to it, and book two has a fantasy horror mystery thrill to it. And I want to keep both elements because I think that a sweeping 9 book epic fantasy series with adventure and mystery is really fun. And I think that these stories, general nature, the construct of just the story and the setting and the sort of characters that are in it and the background that you have for why all these events are happening do lend itself to moments of horror, which I do intend to keep in the books. But I think every book I want to have almost it's obviously a cohesive vibe, but I want them to feel like, oh, what's this next book going to be like? What's this next book going to be like? I'm really planning for book three, despite the fact that it's a medieval setting, to have almost like a buddy cop Western feel to it while still maintaining horror elements. So I think it's going to be just like fun mashups of things that you don't expect in the fantasy genre.
What do you think the challenges will be now that you've got 2 books in the series done? What are the challenges going to be sitting down to write book 3?
I think the biggest challenge that I've been facing this past month, now that I haven't been writing, I haven't even really picked up the computer or any of my notebooks or anything. I've just been mulling it over in my head. I think the biggest challenge is going to be which character starts off book 3, because there's a myriad of options to get that story going. And it's just choosing the one that will have the most impactful, hit the ground running, kind of shock and awe factor for the beginning of book 3. That I think really that's the hardest current problem that I am encountering with it.
In writing these books, do you stick fairly closely to your outline, your initial plans for the books and the series, or do you find that sometimes the characters take you on slight detours, let's say?
I think, for the most part, I think I'm staying relatively true to the vision that I had a few years ago when I started writing the series. I think it helps knowing where these characters are going to end up, because at least if you have a destination in mind, even if you take detours, you know what general direction you've got to be heading in. But I think one of the fun things about writing is that once you have those very fleshed out 3-dimensional characters that you really get to know. I mean, book 1 was 300 something thousand words. Book 2 came in at 290 something thousand words. So I spent a lot of time and care with these characters. And I think the really fun part about that is that, you could have a chapter and you're like, this is what's going to happen. We're going to get from A to B, but you realize you can add in these moments, just like little incidental moments, a paragraph or two, maybe even a page, where you can really expound on a character's personality and kind of add some layer to it, make it feel more real. And then while you're doing that, all of a sudden something comes to you and it's like you see these pieces you didn't see before and you can make a connection to a different part of the story and it just weaves together better that way. So I think for the most part, yeah, I'm staying true to what I had envisioned, but also discovering things that I didn't know could be there that have made writing not only more fun, but I think the reading more fun for the people reading the story.
I'd like to talk about lessons learned since you've now got two books out and plans for this series. I'm curious, your and correct me if I'm wrong, but your background, your degree is in creative writing.
Yes.
You've written one book, you've written a second book, plans for a third and on. How different is the craft and the job of being a writer now that you've done it? How is it different from what you thought it would be after graduating from college and starting it?
I'll say, so I'm going to separate my answer into two parts because I think job and craft, I've learned very different things for both aspects of my career as a writer. I think for the craft, when I was writing book one, I worked with this mentality that when I sat down to write a chapter, I would not stop until I finished that chapter. So I may write 3 pages and turn on an episode of Law and Order, and then I would go back and write 3 more pages, and then, oh, maybe an episode of Great British Bake Off, and then write 3 more pages, and now we finish that chapter. We don't have to work for the rest of the night. That chapter's in the bag. It's done. Book two, I had a very different plan of attack. I think what I did for book one worked for book one because it really made me hone in on what I was doing, and finishing those chapters in one day when I was writing them, it kept me focused on the world and the setting of the characters, and I was really acquainting myself with them while I was writing it. So I think that plan of attack really worked when I was doing book one. For book two, I knew my setting, I knew my world, I knew my characters, I knew what was going on. I didn't have to acquaint myself with them. We're old friends at this point. We've spent a lot of time together. So when I was sitting down to write chapters for book two, it was very much, I'm not trying to build this character. They're built. I am now trying to dive further into it. So it was more of when I was writing those chapters, I was very much in the heads of the characters I had created. So it was sometimes I had to get up and walk away because I knew I was getting too deep into the psychological of it, and I needed to step back, and I was getting too bogged down, and I would take a couple of days, which probably is why book two took so much longer. But it was more of a finding the spirit of the character now that in book one I had built their body. And that took a lot longer. And I think I will incorporate both approaches when I'm working on book three, now that I really have who these people are down really well at this point, I think. And I hope it comes through in the writing. But so I think when I really decide definitively how I'm going to start book three off, I think it'll go much quicker. I think I got those foundations. I know what I'm doing. I know what I want to be doing. And I no longer have that uncertainty that I had in book two. I was so nervous writing book two that the characters weren't going to sound like themselves or they weren't going to feel like themselves. And that's why chapters were taking so long, because I kept having to walk away and I would go reread parts of book one to make sure I was really getting at what I wanted to get at and that the characters still sounded like themselves and behaved like themselves. But I think I've got more confidence now. Like you said, I've got 2 books behind me. I've got more confidence going into book 3. So I think it'll go quicker. As for the actual job, I mean, I think people don't recognize that writing books is just, I'm sitting down and I'm writing and now I'm done. I wrote my manuscript and I send it off to everybody else and they do all the work and my work is done, because it's not like that. There's a lot of work that goes into a book other than writing it. A lot of people are involved in helping shape that process. I have a wonderful editor who I worked with on both books. And I hopefully will work with her again on book 3. She's very well acquainted with the story and the setting and the characters. So it's fun to work with her because she can call me out on things. But having the editor really helps. And then the technicality of how is the cover going to look? How is it going to match up with book 1? I'm doing all of that by myself because I just like to be in control of it. It's my brain baby, so I'm very protective of that work. So getting the covers done to match the feel of the story and then to match each other so they look nice on a bookshelf side by side, things like that was a big learning curve, but I feel like I really got it down much quicker doing it for book 2. So hopefully everything in book 3 will just go a bit smoother now that I've got some experience.
What sort of advice would you give someone? Let's say someone starting out, they have an idea for a book, they're writing a book, they've finished a book. What do you say to new writers?
I think one of the best pieces of advice that I could give a new writer, if you have written a story and you think this is what you want to do as a career and you really want to get your work out there, I would say you can't be too precious with what you've done. You have to be willing to listen to other people and take the criticism of what does and doesn't work, because everything you put on the page you're going to think is great. And sometimes you need to cut it, and that's okay. And then conversely, be protective of what you did. If you think that something should stay in and you can make a case for why it should stay in, I think you should really fight to keep that, because sometimes people don't see the bigger picture because they can't see the bigger picture. I've had multiple times talks with my editor where she said, "Oh, you should cut this." And I really have dug my heels in. I was like, I am going to keep this in here because I know it's going to come up later. It's going to pay off in a different book. It just may seem like fluff in this book. So you have to be willing to fight for what you've done, what you've worked on. And it's not always easy. And you're going to get criticism for it. And it's not always going to be understood by people because they don't know what you're working towards. And I think you just have to be resilient in that regard. I think everything you have to do in any creative field, because it's something that's so personal, it's coming from you, you have to be resilient and really know yourself and know your work and just stay true to what you want to be doing.
How do you keep track of the story, of the details? Because like you said, the books are long and you've got a plan for this epic series. How do you keep track of it all?
You're not the first one to ask. And I never feel like I have a really good answer. I mean, I keep a running note sheet on Microsoft Note, but for the most part, other than like really minuscule details that I write down, it's just up in my head, and I don't find it particularly difficult to keep track of a cast of like 30 characters through over 1,000 pages between these two books. I don't know, it's not very hard for me, which I still feel like is a terribly unsatisfactory answer, but it's the truth.
Well, other than your goals for this series and finishing book 3 and on till the series is complete, what other goals do you have as a writer? Are there other things that you want to do?
Yes, but so the story of Fynneas is really my passion project, which is so cliche to say, and I'm scowling as I said it because it sounds so corny, but it is true, because this story started forming when I was in school. When I was in high school, I had this idea. When I was in college, I kind of honed it more, and I wrote a big outline of what I wanted to do that was like 400 pages. Funnily enough, it was originally supposed to be an epic that took place in ancient Rome. So clearly a lot of things have changed. But that foundational story of Finn, whose name obviously used to not be Finn, but that story that Finn has, that he's telling through his journey through these 9 books, has been with me. And it's something that really means a lot to me. So, finishing that series is my big goal, but I also have always really liked art. There was a time when I was in school, I almost switched my degree in my junior year to major in art. UCF is very well known for its art and animation programs. It's one of the best in the country, and I was really, really seriously considering switching over to animation because it had been something that I had also always really loved all my life. I've always been drawing. I've always loved animated film and shows and everything. So it was something I gave a lot of consideration to, and I ended up sticking with creative writing as my major, but I never stopped drawing. I never stopped loving art. So in the process of writing book two, I've invested in having, professional art tablets and really working on honing my craft on paper. And then, once I come back from vacations and everything, and book two's out in the wild, and I can have a little time to decompress before jumping back into working really hard on book three, going to be working on, honing the craft of digital art, because I really do want to translate the books into a graphic novel series and kind of break them up chunk by chunk, like 5 chapters into one volume of a graphic novel, and really have the visual version of the story out there as well.
Very nice. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. If people want to learn more about you and what's going on, new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you?
So my website for myself is brooklynquintana.com. It has information about me, my background, what I've worked on, my qualifications, things like that, as well as information about the publishing house that I own, Morpheus Media LLC, which I really would like to branch out and help other starting out young authors work on their books. I think with that degree in creative writing and literature, I would definitely be able to help other young authors through an editing process or just streamlining their work. So I really want to do that. So there's information about that on there as well as new releases. I'm also on Instagram at brooklyn.quintana. It's not a very original handle, but you can find me there. I post a lot about my books, and the books themselves have their own official Instagram where I post about what's going on with the releases, what events I'm going to be doing, what podcasts, and that's the Instagram at official Fynneas Fog.
Very good. And if people want to purchase a copy of Blood in the Water or the first book, Nine of Swords, where can they go to buy them?
You can get them on Amazon or any online book retailer. They're at Walmart, Barnes and Noble online. They should be available through there. Amazon is probably your quickest bet, but everybody shops on Amazon.
Good. Well, Brooklyn, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with Fynneas Fog, Blood in the Water, and the book 3, Works in Progress. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting me again. It was great talking with you and talking about the books.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.